Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. The federal government is about to run out of spending authority, meaning every federal activity Donald Trump deems not essential is shut down. If this happens, this would instantly lay off hundreds of thousands of federal bureaucrats, no DOGE required. In fact, the White House has already ordered federal agencies to, quote, prepare mass layoff plans, but also automatically defund an army of millions of left-wing NGOs. It would instantly balance the federal budget. Who knew it was that easy? So federal spending is voted 1 year at a time, and it runs out at midnight tomorrow. Republicans in Congress proposed extending spending, so-called clean continuing resolution. The Democrats demanded over $1 trillion in new money for health care for illegals, health care for able-bodied Medicaid recipients, along with refunding foreign aid, NPR, and PBS. In other words, demands they knew Republicans cannot accept. Now, last time we hit a shutdown in March, Democrats surrendered to protect their federal workers from DOGE. This time, it looks like the activists are forcing them to fight. Of course, Republicans should want a shutdown to slash the federal oligarchy, but they historically wimp out because legacy media always blames Republicans when government workers make shutdowns as painful as possible. Indeed, a passel of recent polls showed voters would disproportionately blame the GOP. One says 34% blame Republicans, 23% blame Dems, 34% blame both. Of course, media polls could be fake. The day before the 2024 election, polls had Trump at -9 approval. 24 hours later, he won the election. More important, done right, a shutdown should be popular. So historically, our occupying bureaucracy intentionally made shutdowns painful. They cut school lunches, threatened Social Security, closed national parks. In fact, they spend extra money to fence off national parks. There's actually a name for this, the Washington Monument Strategy, also known as Firemen First or School Lunches First. Thing is, it does not have to be this way. Trump alone gets to decide which parts are essential and therefore stay open. So keep the parks, keep the school lunches, fire the rest. In practice, that would be at least a third of the federal government shut down, the parts voters don't like. Then keep paying the essentials with incoming tax revenue. Now, this is not necessarily legal, but Democrats are not stupid enough to block Social Security checks and military pay for potentially months. So if they had a pair, Republicans in Congress would shut it down for years. This is fun for a number of reasons. First, shutting down a third of the federal government saves $200 billion per month. That would instantly balance the budget. In fact, we'd be in surplus. Even better, a durable shutdown lays off 740,000 federal workers, about 4 times what they did with DOGE. Note, federal grants also pay an estimated 3 million employees of overwhelmingly left-wing NGOs. Those would all be gone. In other words, a real shutdown would wipe out the progressive revolution. They'd be down to brainwashed college students. So what's next? We've dreamed the dream too many times to hope for much. Odds on prediction market Kalshi are 64% for a shutdown this year. But going by history, it won't last long. Too many rhinos are afraid of the media or of donors. But if Dems want the fight, and if Trump steps up, it could get very interesting. China's economy is, quote, slowing sharply as the trade war enters its 5th month, while every other major trade partner has made a deal with Trump. It's across the board. China's retail sales are slowing, industrial production missed expectations. Investment is crawling at just 0.5%, the worst since the 2020 pandemic. Urban joblessness, which is the only kind China cares about, is about 1/5 higher than the U.S. Youth unemployment is nearly 18%, up 3 points in a single month. Still, the numbers are not as bad as many predicted. Unlike Mexico or Germany, China is not crashing. Now, this could be fake. China is famous for massaging statistics on a scale that puts our lying Bureau of Labor Statistics to shame. As the New York Times puts it, quote, China's ability to tightly control information has prevented unfettered conversations about the toll inflicted by the trade war. China stopped publishing hundreds of economic statistics once the trade war began. Still, China is not in free fall for 2 reasons, stimulus and dumping. So far, China's dumped $1.6 trillion of stimulus to dull the pain, along with unconventional moves like forcing 867,000 state-owned firms to buy their own shares and, quote, investigating private brokerages who also sell shares. Second, China's actually increased exports to everybody but the U.S. Now, a big hunk is tariff evasion, where Chinese ships stop in Vietnam, unload and reload, keep going to LA, and presto, it's a Vietnam import. But another hunk is dumping the stuff they can't sell in America below cost into Europe and the Third World. So Temu's Latin American shipments have soared 143% this year. There was a recent uproar in Indonesia about Chinese jeans selling for 80 cents. None of this is sustainable. Trump's new deals are explicitly targeting reshipments, while countries are already pushing back on Chinese dumping. The EU imposed new tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. India is targeting Chinese steel. Mexico is targeting Chinese cars. In fact, China knows it's not sustainable, recently moving to starve marginal factories of capital to reduce overcapacity, in other words, to shut them down. In short, China has so far avoided the worst, assuming you believe official numbers, but it's running out of runway on both stimulus and dumping. Now, China has 40 days until November 11th to make a deal with Trump, or tariffs jump back to 145%, up from 30% today. The outstanding issues include barriers to American food, energy, and services, forced tech transfers, where China forces foreign companies to share tech and even train their competitors, along with so-called industrial policy, where Beijing gives cheap money to exporters. And Trump being Trump, he will probably want guaranteed Chinese purchases of American goods. Last time around, it was $200 billion, which they never bought, using COVID as the excuse. So as such, both sides seem motivated. China backed off a ban on rare earth exports, which are used to make American weapons. A single F-35 contains a half ton of rare earths. Meanwhile, China's rhetoric has been uncharacteristically tame. They're no longer calling Trump a self-serving narcissistic bandit. For his part, Trump just postponed a planned arms sale to Taiwan and could even shift America's Taiwan stance from neutrality to opposing independence, which is a holy grail for China. So most likely, they will come to an agreement by November, and if they don't, China goes from a 30% tariff slowdown to a 145% collapse. A word from our sponsor. If you own gold, and many of you do, you already understand how it protects your wealth from the insanity coming out of Washington. The inflation, the recessions, the wars. But with monetary metals, there's a way to actually earn a yield of up to 4% on your gold, paid in more ounces of gold. You retain ownership of real, allocated physical gold with no storage costs while your ounces grow every month outside the banking system. If you're serious about protecting your future and building your legacy, head to monetarymetals.com/Peter to get started. Now back to our show. Congratulations, America. The federal government is shut down. That was easy. You probably didn't notice unless you're cashing a check at taxpayer expense, like the 740,000 federal workers who are now furloughed, or the army of millions of tax-funded left-wing NGOs that are now cut off. If you're just tuning in, the federal budget is voted 1 year at a time, and it ran out at midnight. Meaning, in theory, the government is not allowed to spend any more money. It is shut down. Of course, the vast majority of government, at least 70%, is exempt and keeps grinding. That includes so-called mandatory spending like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, as well as essential functions like the military, air traffic, courts, and the Department of Justice. The Federal Reserve sadly keeps going since it literally prints its budget in the basement. Now, historically, politicians fear shutdown since our rogue federal oligarchy tries to make them as painful as possible, so rather than cutting, say, welfare to illegals, or gender transitions for federal prisoners, they cut school lunches, firefighters, and shutter national parks, called the Washington Monument Strategy, or Firemen First. But given Donald Trump alone gets to decide what's essential, he can keep the stuff voters want and toss the rest, raising the tantalizing prospect that a shutdown could actually be popular, in which case it could go on for a long time. Now that's fun because shuttering a third of the federal government would instantly balance the budget. It would lay off roughly 740,000 federal workers, in addition to the millions of defunded NGOs. Now, combined with the DOGE layoffs, that would mean more than half
of federal workers outside the Post Office and Department of War would be permanently fired. The key is how long does the shutdown last? Because there's a magic number, 61 days, where Trump can permanently lay off those federal workers. This is because you have to give federal workers 60 days notice of termination called reduction in force. So if you're still at shutdown at day 61, you complete the termination, they are gone. On the other hand, if you don't terminate them, then when government tragically reopens, they get back pay for the entire shutdown, even though they didn't work. Now, 61 days would be by far the longest government shutdown. The current record holder is 35 days back in 2018 over Trump's border wall. That one had so little impact, you probably don't remember it. Now, back then, people like Rush Limbaugh urged Trump to keep going, but of course, legacy media was pounding rhinos while Dems controlled the House, so Trump had to give up. This time, he does not have to. Legacy media ain't what it used to be, and rhinos should fear their voters instead of a crippled legacy media. So as next, prediction market Kalshi is currently projecting just 8 days of shutdown, with 13% odds it lasts longer than 35 days. That implies either Republicans cave, boosting Obamacare subsidies or Medicaid for illegals, or that Democrats cave, saving their government workers despite their Antifa wing and donor wing demanding a fight. So odds are we will not get to that 61-day paradise. Instead, Congress will kick the can once more. GDP is on fire despite tariffs. Hardest hit is the army of doomcasters who have been praying for a Trump slump. Last week, the Bureau of Economic Statistics revised GDP growth for the second quarter up to an impressive 3.8%, up from 3.0% in their original estimate. The revision was growth in consumer spending, while imports unsurprisingly fell. In other words, Americans are spending more, and it is going to domestic producers. Meanwhile, the Atlanta Fed now estimates GDP in the third quarter, the one we're in now, will come in at 3.9%. Note, we had a negative GDP number in Trump's first quarter, which was a statistical figment of import front-loading. So even it out for all of 2025, and prediction market Kalshi predicts 1.9% growth for the year. Now, 1.9 is perfectly respectable, considering mass deportations and federal layoffs mechanically subtract from GDP, even though they make us richer. As in, GDP counts all government spending, even welfare for migrants or paying EPA bureaucrats to shut down farms, while GDP also counts migrant spending when they get haircuts or go to the dentist. Given an estimated 2 million illegals have left while 200,000 federal workers have been laid off, we shed a lot of fake GDP. Moreover, 1.9 is a big jump from what it was predicted back in April during the trade war. Back then, growth for the year was supposed to be just 0.5%, which is nearly a recession. Now, it could be a lot better, but the Fed has kept interest rates high. It's very hard to get 3% growth when rates are 5%. Moreover, Congress missed their chance to return trillions of stolen goods to the American people by cutting spending, while deregulation, which also grows the economy, has been a lot slower than many of us hoped for when DOGE kicked off. So what's next? For the next year, going into the all-important midterms, the biggest moving parts on GDP are rate cuts at the Fed and investment, including oil drilling and factory building under Trump. On the Fed, every point of rate cut is worth roughly 850,000 jobs and 1.5 points of GDP, and markets are now predicting a full point cut in the coming year, with Trump pushing for 2, so this will be a big boost for both jobs and GDP. The other is investment. So oil production has barely moved this year, it's up just 2%, because it takes a long time to sink a new well, while environmental red tape is still a problem. But that should start coming online in the next 12 months. Much bigger is the factory boom that's coming, much of it extorted from countries like Japan or Europe as part of Trump's trade deals, while Trump arm twists companies like Apple or Taiwan Semiconductor to build in America. So far, there's at least $4 trillion in additional investment coming, which is more than the entire economy normally produces. And historically, every trillion of investment is good for more than 1 million jobs. So it'll take time to get all that money deployed, but between rate cuts and investment, we could be looking at monster numbers by 2027.
A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Last week, a Reuters poll found Republicans are running 18 points ahead on immigration, 20 ahead on crime, 12 on foreign policy, 10 on the economy, with one very dark cloud, inflation. Polling says Trump is underwater by 20 points on the second biggest election issue after immigration. Now, to be fair, voters don't think Democrats have a plan either, but prices are Trump's Achilles heel. Especially when he swore on the campaign trail, quote, starting day one, we will end inflation, prices will come down fast with everything. In fact, inflation has slowed a lot since Biden, but prices are not coming down. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. The most obvious is Congress did not cut spending. They did slow it a lot, so federal spending is up 1.5% this year compared to 10% in Biden's last year. But what would it take to actually lower prices? In short, you have two options, either a mass extinction of crony regulations that collectively add roughly 20% to the cost of everything you buy, or failing that, a Wall Street gutting sell-off of trillions in assets the Fed bought with printed money. So main parts of CPI inflation are housing, 36%, energy and food, 20%, healthcare, 20%, and manufactured imports, which are about 10%. Now, house prices actually go up with rate cuts, which are finally happening, since lower mortgages bid prices up. So even with cutting red tape, it's very hard to move that number. On energy, prices are coming down a lot. They're actually down 20% since Trump took office, but they'd be down a lot more, again, without environmentalist red tape. Meanwhile, on tariffs, so far foreigners and middlemen are eating them, but a tax on imports obviously is not making them cheaper. That brings us to the big ones, food and healthcare. American food prices are up to 15% higher because of red tape and mandates, while healthcare could be double or more. In fact, healthcare prices is driving the current shutdown. So deregulation in food includes letting farmers plant what they want, letting them sell direct to customers, letting them hire their own inspectors, and getting rid of environmental straitjackets that wipe out family farms. On healthcare, the keys are price transparency and cost sharing, so hospitals have an incentive to cut prices, and customers have an incentive to seek out those lower prices, along with expanded scope of work so you don't need a doctor for the sniffles, reining in ambulance chaser trial lawyers, and, of course, repealing so-called con laws, where hospitals can literally veto new competitors. Now, Trump's trying his best, including a DOGE-driven repeal of tens of thousands of regulations that aren't even authorized. But regulations are bought with good donor money, so that will be trench warfare. That all brings us to the other rabbit in the hat, the Federal Reserve, specifically pawning off the $6 trillion stash they bought with printed money during COVID. Now, $6 trillion is good for roughly 30% of the money supply. So if you pawn it all off, you get 30% deflation. Unfortunately, Wall Street is so dependent on that flood of money that it could set off a financial panic. In fact, we already got mini panics in 2013 and 2019 when the Fed tried pawning off some of its 2008 stash. So what's next? Trump promised lower prices, but with Congress spending like teens on meth, the only way we get them is either massive cuts to red tape or gut Wall Street and damn the torpedoes. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersaintange.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.